Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. What I'm about to tell you is the single most enduring mystery of my life, something I've thought about for decades now. I'm okay with meeting my maker without having understood the great whys and hows of the world, but I'd do just about anything to know the truth of what I saw out in the woods all those years ago. If any of you listening are familiar with anything I'm talking about, just know that I'll be lurking in the comments section, reading everything you have to say if I find out this story makes it to a video. It was October of 2021 when everything happened. I was 23 then, fresh out of college and working my first real job at an accounting firm. The stress had been eating at me for months. Deadlines, spreadsheets, the fluorescent lights that hummed constantly overhead. When my friend Greg suggested a camping trip, I jumped at the chance. He'd rounded up our mutual friend Steven and Steven's girlfriend Mina. The four of us had been close since high school, though adult life had started pulling us in different directions. We chose a spot near Washington and Jefferson National Forest in Virginia, a place Greg had heard about from his uncle who used to hunt there. The drive out took us 5 hours, winding through increasingly narrow roads as civilization fell away behind us. The last gas station we saw was 40 miles from our destination, a rundown place with flickering lights and a clerk who watched us with suspicious eyes when we bought supplies. "You boys heading up to the forest?" he'd asked, his voice gravelly from years of cigarettes. When we nodded, he shook his head slowly. "Been strange things happening up there lately. Animals acting weird, hikers going missing for days, then showing up with no memory of where they'd been." Greg laughed it off, but I noticed Mina grip Steven's hand tighter as we walked back to the car. The trail to our campsite wound through dense forest, the canopy so thick that afternoon felt like dusk. Every sound seemed amplified, our boots crushing leaves, our breath coming harder as we climbed. The strange calls of birds I couldn't identify. Twice we passed other hikers coming down, and both times they moved quickly, barely making eye contact, as if eager to leave the woods behind. We found our spot in a small clearing surrounded by tall oaks and maples. The ground was relatively flat, covered in a thick carpet of fallen leaves that crunched beneath our feet. As we set up the tents, Greg and me in one, Steven and Mina in another, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Not by anything I could see, but the sensation was there, crawling along my skin like insects. That first night we built our fire and sat around it, trying to recapture the easy camaraderie of our younger years. But the forest pressed in around us, dark and vast. When the wind picked up, the trees groaned and swayed, their branches scraping against each other in a sound that resembled whispers. I kept turning to look over my shoulder, certain I'd see someone standing just beyond the firelight's reach. "Did you guys hear that?" Mina asked at one point, her voice tight. We all listened. There was something, a rhythmic sound, almost like footsteps circling our camp at a distance. Greg grabbed a flashlight and swept it through the trees, but the beam revealed nothing except shadows dancing between the trunks. "Probably just a deer," Steven said, but he pulled Mina closer to him. The second day started beautifully. Morning sun filtered through the leaves, painting everything gold and amber. We hiked a nearby trail, taking photos of the foliage, gathering chestnuts to roast later. For a few hours, the unease of the previous night faded. We were just four friends enjoying nature, laughing at Greg's terrible jokes, stopping to watch squirrels prepare for winter. But as the day wore on, clouds rolled in, turning the sky the color of old pewter. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in an hour. We headed back to camp earlier than planned, and that's when we realized we'd burned through most of our gathered firewood. The nights were getting longer. Sunset came before 6 o'clock, and we needed enough wood to keep the fire going for at least 8 hours to ward off the cold. Greg volunteered to gather more, heading out with a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. He'd been gone maybe 20 minutes when we heard him shouting from deep in the woods. Not a scream of fear, but urgent calling. Guys, you need to see this." We found him standing in a grove of birch trees about 300 yards from camp. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he pointed at the ground. At first I thought I was looking at a small cemetery, rectangular patches of disturbed earth, each about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, arranged in neat rows beneath the trees. The soil was dark and freshly turned, standing out starkly against the blanket of dead leaves. "Look at the trees," Greg whispered. That's when I saw them. Carved into the bark of each tree, positioned about 5 feet from the ground, were faces, human faces, rendered in disturbing detail. The work was fresh. Sap still wept from some of the cuts like tears. Each face was unique. An old woman with deep wrinkles around her closed eyes, a young man with a strong jaw, a child with round cheeks. All of them had their eyes carved shut, as if sleeping, or dead. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone, but there was no signal. We practically ran back to camp, and I climbed onto a large boulder, holding my phone high until I got one bar. The 911 call kept dropping, but finally I got through. The dispatcher sounded skeptical when I described what we'd found, but she said she'd send a ranger. While we waited, none of us could stop talking about what we'd seen. Stephen counted at least 12 graves. Mina noticed that some of the faces looked unfinished, as if the carver had been interrupted. Greg pointed out something I'd missed. Small objects hanging from branches near each tree. Tiny bundles wrapped in cloth, swaying in the breeze. The ranger who arrived was a woman in her 50s named Carol. She had the weathered look of someone who'd spent their life outdoors, and she listened to our story with professional patience. But when we led her to the grove, her entire demeanor changed. Her hand went to the radio on her belt, and she backed away from the nearest tree as if it might attack her. "This is Ranger Unit 7, she said into her radio, her voice steady but tense. "I need state police at coordinates I'm about to send. Possible crime scene. Multiple locations." She turned to us. "You folks need to pack up your camp, now." Are there bodies?" Mina asked. Carol didn't answer directly. "There's a motel about an hour south. I suggest you head there for the night. We'll need statements from all of you, but that can wait until tomorrow." We should have left immediately. That would have been the smart thing. But it takes time to break down camp, and the sun was already setting. We worked fast, shoving gear into bags without the usual careful organization. The woods around us had transformed. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every sound made us freeze and look around wildly. As Greg and I collapsed our tent, I noticed something odd. Footprints in the soft earth around where our tent had been. Bare footprints, with unusually long toes. They circled our tent multiple times. I didn't tell the others. They were already scared enough. We loaded the car in record time, but as Stephen turned the key, the engine sputtered and died. He tried again. Nothing. The battery was fine, the lights worked, but the engine wouldn't turn over. "We'll have to wait for the police," Carol said. She'd stayed with us, and I was grateful for her presence. "They'll be here within the hour." That hour felt like a lifetime. We sat in the car with the doors locked, watching darkness consume the forest. Carol stood outside, her flashlight beam sweeping back and forth. Twice she stopped and stared intently at something in the trees, her hand moving to the weapon on her hip, though she never drew it. Then we heard it. Singing. Multiple voices, harmonizing in a language I didn't recognize. The sound came from the direction of the grove, rising and falling in waves. Carol immediately got on her radio, her voice urgent. The singing continued for maybe 10 minutes, then stopped abruptly, as if cut off mid-note. The state police arrived in force, 3 cars with lights flashing, followed by what looked like a forensics van. They took our statements separately, each of us sitting in a different police car, recounting what we'd seen. The detective who questioned me, a tall man named Morrison, kept asking about details I hadn't consciously noticed. Had I seen any symbols carved along with the faces? Were there any unusual smells? Did the soil look like it had been disturbed recently, or had it settled? Around midnight, they got our car started, a loose wire, apparently, and escorted us to the motel Carol had mentioned. But before we left, Morrison pulled me aside. "We've been tracking something in these woods for 3 months," he said quietly. "Hikers reporting strange altars. Animals found arranged in patterns. And now this." He handed me his card. "If you remember anything else, anything at all, call me." At the motel, none of us slept. We sat in Greg and my room, talking in whispers, trying to make sense of what we'd experienced. Mina had a theory about a cult, possibly using the forest for rituals. Stephen thought it might be an artist, someone creating an installation about death and memory. Greg didn't say much, just stared at the wall, occasionally shaking his head. Around 3 in the morning, my phone rang. It was Morrison. "I'm calling to let you know we've completed the initial excavation," he said. "We didn't find human remains. The graves were empty. But," he paused, "we found something else. In each grave there was a wooden box. Inside the boxes were personal items, watches, rings, photographs, driver's licenses, all from different people. Some of the IDs date back 20 years. We spent the next day at the police station, looking through photographs of the items they'd found. I recognized nothing, but Mina gasped when she saw one picture. A silver locket with an intricate engraving. "My aunt had one just like this," she said. "She went missing while hiking 5 years ago. They found her 3 weeks later, alive but different. She couldn't remember what had happened, and she never went into the woods again." The police took this very seriously. They brought in specialists, people who studied ritual behavior and criminal psychology. We were interviewed again, this time with more detailed questions. Had we experienced any lost time? Did we have any unexplained marks on our bodies? Had we had any unusual dreams since the incident? That last question made me pause. I had been having dreams. In them, I was walking through the forest at night, following someone whose face I couldn't see. They led me to the grove, where the carved faces had opened their eyes and were watching me. Their mouths moved as if speaking, but no sound came out. I always woke just as I reached out to touch one of the trees. The investigators exchanged meaningful looks when I described this. They showed me photographs of other sites they'd found in different parts of the forest. All had similar elements: disturbed earth, carved trees, personal items buried without their owners. They told me about hikers who'd gone missing and returned with no memory, about rangers who'd quit after seeing things they couldn't explain, about local legends dating back to the original colonial settlements. 2 weeks later, Morrison called with an update. They'd made no arrests. The investigation was ongoing, but it hit dead ends. The DNA from the personal items matched missing persons reports from across 3 states, but many of those people had been found alive, just like Mina's aunt. They had no memory of losing the items or being in the forest. The carved faces didn't match any of the missing persons. A wood-carving expert estimated they'd been made with professional tools by someone with significant skill. The type of cuts suggested the work had been done quickly, possibly in a single night. But there were no fingerprints, no DNA evidence, no trail to follow. The empty graves remained the biggest mystery. Why dig them? Why bury personal items but no bodies? Why carve faces that didn't match the item's owners? Morrison had one theory he shared with me unofficially. "What if it's not about the dead?" he said. "What if it's about the living? Like someone's trying to bury parts of people while they're still alive. Their memories, their identities, pieces of who they are." That thought haunts me more than any other. It's been 2 years since that camping trip. Greg moved to another state and doesn't like to talk about what happened. Stephen and Mina broke up 6 months later. She said she couldn't stop having nightmares, and he couldn't understand why she couldn't just move on. I still live in the same city, still work at the same job, but something fundamental changed in me that October. I've done my own research. There are stories, scattered across decades, of similar sites found in forests across Appalachia. Always empty graves, always carved faces, always personal items from people who turned up alive but changed. There's no explanation that makes sense, no pattern that leads anywhere. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I think about driving back to those woods. Part of me needs to see if the graves are still there, if the faces still watch with closed eyes. But another part, the wiser part, knows that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. What I experienced wasn't supernatural in any provable way. No monsters, no ghosts, no impossible occurrences. Just empty graves and carved faces and the absolute certainty that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong in those woods. That's what makes it truly terrifying, not knowing whether we stumbled upon something ending or something just beginning. If any of you have experienced something similar, please reach out. Maybe together we can piece together a truth that none of us can face alone. Or maybe we'll just confirm what I've suspected all along, that there are things in this world that operate by rules we don't understand, leaving traces we can see but never fully comprehend. The graves are still out there. The faces still watch with wooden eyes. And somewhere, someone is still digging. I grew up in a small town nestled in the mountains of Montana, where the nearest grocery store was 20 miles away, and everyone knew everyone else's business. Back when I was 19 years old, I took a job as a night porter at Pine Ridge Cabins, a collection of rental properties scattered across 15 acres of forest land. The position paid better than flipping burgers at the diner in town, and the work seemed simple enough. Keep an eye on things, handle late check-ins, and make sure nothing went wrong while the guests slept. The office sat at the entrance of the property, a small wooden building with two large glass panel windows facing the gravel parking area and a glass-paneled door between them. During the day, sunlight flooded through those windows, but at night they became black mirrors reflecting the dim interior lights back at you. Beyond the glass, the darkness was absolute. No street lights, no nearby houses, just endless forest pressing in from all sides. My boss, a gruff man named Bernard, who'd owned the property for 30 years, had recently installed a VHS player in the office. He claimed it was to keep the night porters alert and prevent us from dozing off during our shifts. I suspected he just felt guilty about leaving us alone out there for 8 hours with nothing but a telephone and a logbook for company. Either way, I wasn't complaining. I'd started stopping by the video rental store in town before my shifts, picking up whatever looked interesting for $3 a night. On this particular evening in October 2016, I'd rented Hellraiser, a horror film I'd heard about but never seen. The fall air had turned cold that week, with temperatures dropping into the 30s at night. I'd arrived at 7 in the evening, checked in with the day porter, a college student named Thomas who was always eager to leave, and settled into the office chair with a thermos of coffee and a sandwich my mother had packed for me. The first few hours passed uneventfully. I logged a couple returning from dinner at 9:30. At 10:15, I took a walk around the property with my flashlight, checking that all the cabin doors were locked and no vehicles were parked where they shouldn't be. Everything looked normal. The guests in cabins 3, 7, and 12 had their lights on, probably reading or watching the small televisions that came with each rental. Cabin 9 was dark, but I knew 4 people had checked in there earlier that afternoon because Thomas had mentioned it during our handoff. I returned to the office, rewound the tape to the beginning, and pressed play. The movie's opening scene flickered across the small television screen. A man buying a puzzle box in Morocco. I turned up the volume just loud enough to hear the dialogue over the hum of the space heater in the corner. By 1 in the morning, I was thoroughly engrossed in the film, despite or perhaps because of how unsettling it was. The Cenobites had just appeared, their grotesque faces filling the screen, when I heard something outside. A shuffling sound, like something dragging across the gravel. I paused the movie and listened. Nothing, just the wind moving through the pine trees and the distant hoot of an owl. I resumed the film, but less than a minute later I heard it again. This time it was closer to the office, and the sound was more distinct. It wasn't the crunch of boots on gravel. It was something else entirely. A scraping, irregular movement that didn't match the rhythm of human footsteps. My first thought was an animal. Bears occasionally wandered through the property, especially in the fall when they were fattening up before winter. Mountain lions were rarer, but not unheard of. Bernard had shown me how to use the revolver he kept in the cash safe during my first week, explaining that it was primarily for dangerous wildlife, though he admitted it also provided some deterrent against the rare problematic guest. I muted the television completely and sat perfectly still, straining to hear. The sound came again, definitely closer now. It was a wet, dragging sound punctuated by what might have been breathing or panting. My heart rate picked up. Whatever was out there was approaching the office, and it was moving in a way that made my instincts scream that something was wrong. I stood up slowly, careful not to let the chair squeak on the wooden floor, and moved to the safe. My hands shook slightly as I worked the combination right twice, left once, right again. The safe door swung open and I pulled out the revolver, feeling its unexpected weight in my palm. I'd never actually had to draw the weapon before. The most excitement I'd encountered in 3 months of working nights was a drunk couple arguing loudly at midnight. Gripping the gun in my right hand, I grabbed the flashlight from the desk with my left and crept toward the lobby area. The office and lobby were really just one L-shaped room, with my desk and the television in one section and the guest check-in area in the other. The lobby had those big glass windows that looked out over the parking area and the path leading to the cabins. During the day, they provided a clear view of anyone arriving. At night, they were black voids. I positioned myself to one side of the windows and clicked on the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the darkness outside. The light caught the edges of parked cars, the corner of cabin 1, the beginning of the gravel path. Nothing moved. I aimed the beam lower, thinking maybe a wounded animal had crawled close to the building. Still nothing but empty ground and scattered pine needles. Then I heard it right beneath the window. A wet, gasping sound followed by that same dragging movement. Whatever it was directly below my line of sight, hidden by the angle of the window and the small wooden deck that surrounded the office entrance. I took a step back, raising the revolver slightly, my finger hovering near the trigger guard. Bernard's voice echoed in my memory. Never point it at anything unless you intend to shoot, and never shoot unless you're certain of what you're shooting at. I was trying to decide whether to open the door and confront whatever was out there when suddenly a shape rose up from beneath the window. In the split second before I jumped backward, my mind registered details in a confused rush. It was a person, a man, his face pressed close to the glass. His mouth was open, and something dark stained his lips and chin. His shirt was soaked with what looked like reddish-brown liquid that gleamed wetly in the reflection of my flashlight. His eyes were unfocused, rolling slightly, and his skin had a grayish tint that looked wrong even in the poor light. I let out a yell. I'm not ashamed to admit it, and stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the chair I'd been sitting in moments before. The man's hand pressed against the glass, leaving a smeared print of that same reddish-brown substance. His mouth moved like he was trying to speak, but I couldn't hear anything through the window. Then his eyes rolled back, his hand slid down the glass, and he collapsed out of view. For several seconds I just stood there, breathing hard. The gun still raised. My training, such as it was, finally kicked in. Someone was hurt. That much was obvious. The staining on his face and clothes, the way he'd collapsed, the complete lack of coordination in his movements. This wasn't a drunk person causing trouble. This was someone in serious medical distress. I rushed to the phone on the desk and dialed 911 with shaking fingers. It rang twice before a woman's voice answered. 911, what's your emergency? I need an ambulance at Pine Ridge Cabins on Highway 87, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. There's a man outside the office. He's hurt, I think. He's got blood on his face, and he collapsed. Is he conscious? The dispatcher asked, her voice calm and professional. I don't know. He was standing a second ago, but then he fell. I'm going to check on him now. Stay on the line with me, she instructed. Can you tell me what happened to him? I don't know. I just heard something outside, and then he appeared at the window. He looked really sick or injured. I'm sending an ambulance to your location now, she said. I could hear her typing in the background. Can you safely approach him and see if he's breathing? I set the phone down on the desk. It had a long cord that stretched into the lobby and moved to the door. The revolver was still in my hand, though I felt slightly ridiculous pointing a gun at someone who clearly needed medical help rather than threatening. Still, Bernard's other piece of advice had been to never assume anything about a situation until you understood it completely. I opened the door and the cold night air rushed in, carrying with it a smell that made me gag, something sour and organic like spoiled meat mixed with chemicals. The man was lying on his side on the wooden deck about 3 feet from the door. In the spill of light from the office, I could see him more clearly now. He was probably in his 40s, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt that had once been blue but was now mostly stained with that reddish-brown substance. It covered his chin and neck, and I realized with growing horror that it wasn't just on him, it was coming from him. As I watched, he gagged weakly and more of the stuff dribbled from his mouth onto the deck. "Sir?" I called out, keeping my distance. "Sir, can you hear me? An ambulance is coming." He made a sound, something between a groan and a word. His eyes opened slightly, but they didn't seem to focus on me. I could hear the dispatcher's voice calling from the phone inside. "Hello? Are you there?" I ran back to the phone, picking it up with the hand that wasn't holding the gun. "He's alive. He's conscious, I think, but he can't really talk. He keeps vomiting this reddish stuff. It looks bad." "Has he been drinking?" the dispatcher asked. Can you smell alcohol? It was a fair question. On a Saturday night in a cabin resort, alcohol-related incidents weren't unusual, but something about this felt different. I went back to the door and called out, "Sir, what did you drink? Can you tell me what you drank?" The man's lips moved. I crouched down, staying out of arm's reach but trying to hear him. He was trying to speak, forcing words through obvious pain. Number? I repeated. What number? 9, he managed, then gagged again, his body convulsing. I ran back to the phone. He said number 9. That's one of our cabins. I think that's where he's staying. There was a pause on the other end of the line. The ambulance is approximately 12 minutes away, the dispatcher said. I need you to stay with him and monitor his breathing. If he stops breathing, you'll need to perform CPR. 12 minutes. I looked at the man on the deck, at the puddle of reddish-brown vomit spreading around him, and felt my stomach turn. But then another thought hit me, one that sent ice-cold fear through my chest. If he was this sick, what about the other people in cabin 9? There are other people in that cabin, I told the dispatcher. At least 3 more. If he's this sick, they might be too. I'll send additional units, she said immediately. How many people total? 4 checked in this afternoon. I need to check on them. Sir, I need you to stay. But I was already setting the phone down. If the other 3 people were in the same condition as this man, 12 minutes might be too long. I grabbed the flashlight and the revolver and ran out into the night, leaving the man on the deck and the dispatcher's voice calling after me. The path to cabin 9 wound through a cluster of pine trees, with smaller paths branching off to the other cabins. My flashlight beam bounced as I ran, creating wild shadows that seemed to leap and dance. The cabins were numbered based on when they'd been built, not their position on the property, so cabin 9 was actually one of the furthest from the office, maybe 200 yards along the main path, then another 50 down a side trail. I covered the distance in less than 2 minutes, my breath coming in gasps that had nothing to do with the physical exertion. As I rounded the final bend, my flashlight caught the cabin's front door standing wide open, and my heart sank. More of that reddish-brown substance was smeared on the front step and the door frame. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding thin and scared even to my own ears. "This is the night porter. Is anyone in there? I'm coming in." The cabin's interior lights were on, casting a warm glow that seemed obscene given what I was seeing. The main room was chaos. Bottles covered every surface. Wine bottles on the dining table, liquor bottles on the kitchen counter, beer bottles lined up on the windowsill. But it was what was between the bottles that made me stop in the doorway. 2 people lay on the floor near the couch, both on their sides, both in that same terrible state as the man at the office. A woman, probably in her late 40s, was closer to the door. Her blonde hair was matted with vomit, and her eyes were closed, but her chest was moving. Shallow, rapid breaths that whistled slightly with each exhale. Beyond her, a man lay curled in a fetal position, his arms wrapped around his stomach. From the kitchen area, I heard retching sounds. I moved farther into the cabin, stepping carefully around the woman on the floor, and found the 4th person, another man bent over the kitchen sink. He was gripping the counter with both hands, his knuckles white, as he vomited into the sink. The substance was definitely reddish-brown, but in the better light of the cabin I could see it had a strange, almost grainy texture like blood mixed with mud. He heard my footsteps and turned his head slightly. His face was pale, almost gray, and sweat poured down his temples. "Help," he managed to say, the word barely more than a whisper. "Please, help us." "An ambulance is coming," I said, though my voice shook. "What did you eat? What happened?" He tried to answer, but another wave of nausea overtook him. He pointed weakly toward the dining table with one trembling hand before turning back to the sink. I moved closer to the table, shining my flashlight across its surface. Wine bottles, 3 of them, all empty or nearly so. Plates with the remnants of what looked like an elaborate meal, pasta, salad, bread. A cake sat in the center, partially eaten. Wine glasses, some still half full, were scattered around the plates. It looked like they'd had a dinner party, a celebration of some kind. But now all 4 of them were dying, and I had no idea why. I ran back to the office at full sprint, my boots pounding against the gravel path. The man on the deck had moved slightly, rolling onto his back, and was making weak gasping sounds. I grabbed the phone, which was still off the hook. "This is Pine Ridge Cabins," I said urgently. I checked cabin 9. There are 3 more people here, all in the same condition. They're all vomiting, barely conscious. It looks like they ate a meal together, but I don't know what made them sick. They need help immediately. Additional ambulances are en route, the dispatcher assured me. "Can you describe what they're vomiting? Any specific color or odor?" "It's reddish brown, kind of thick. The smell is awful. Sour. Chemical. There's alcohol everywhere in the cabin. Lots of empty bottles, but this doesn't look like alcohol poisoning. It's something else. Do not consume any food or drink from that cabin," she instructed. "And try not to touch any surfaces if possible. Is there any indication of what they ate?" "Looks like pasta, salad, cake, a whole dinner. I can't tell which dish might have been bad. Emergency services are approximately 8 minutes away. Stay where you can see the access road and guide them in when they arrive." Those 8 minutes felt like hours. I positioned myself where I could watch both the man on the deck and the road. He was still breathing, but each breath seemed more labored than the last. I'd covered him with a blanket from the office closet, though I wasn't sure if that was the right thing to do. Everything I knew about first aid I'd learned from a 4-hour class when I started the job, and none of it covered anything like this. Finally, I saw headlights in the distance, followed by the flash of red and blue emergency lights. The first ambulance came up the drive faster than I'd have thought possible on the gravel road. I waved my flashlight to guide them to the office, then pointed urgently toward cabin 9. "There are 3 more down at cabin 9, I shouted to the paramedics as they jumped out. "That way about 200 yards. This man came from there." The lead paramedic, a woman in her 30s with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, knelt beside the man on the deck. She took one look at him and immediately called for her partner to bring the stretcher. "How long has he been like this?" "Maybe 15 minutes since I found him. I don't know how long he was sick before that." "Did he say what he consumed?" "No. He could barely talk. Just said number 9, which is his cabin. They had a dinner party. There's food and alcohol everywhere." 2 more ambulances arrived within minutes, and I guided them to cabin 9. The property suddenly swarmed with activity, paramedics rushing back and forth, equipment being unloaded, radios crackling with medical jargon I didn't understand. I stood back, feeling useless and overwhelmed, watching as they loaded the 4 victims onto stretchers and into ambulances. Bernard arrived about 40 minutes after I'd called him, his truck's headlights cutting through the darkness. He was in his early 60s, with gray hair and a weathered face that rarely showed much emotion. But even in the poor light, I could see the shock on his face as he surveyed the scene. "What in God's name happened here?" he asked, staring at cabin 9. "I don't know. They were having dinner, and then they all got sick. Really sick. It happened fast. We watched the last ambulance pull away, its siren wailing as it reached the highway. Then Bernard suggested we check out cabin 9 before the police arrived. They'd been notified and were on their way, but they were coming from the county seat 30 miles away." The cabin was worse than I remembered. In my panic earlier, I'd focused on the people. Now I could really see the devastation they'd left behind. The kitchen sink was filled with that reddish-brown vomit. More of it stained the floor, the couch, the walls in places where someone had clearly stumbled and fallen. The smell hit us like a physical force: blood, stomach acid, and something else, something chemical that burned my nostrils. "It smells like blood in here," Bernard said, his voice tight. "But that vomit, that's not just blood. What the hell is that?" The paramedics didn't say. They just got them loaded up as fast as possible. Bernard moved carefully through the cabin, taking in the scene. He paused at the dining table, studying the empty wine bottles and the remains of the meal. 4 people checked in this afternoon. Late check-in, around 4 o'clock. They were all women, middle-aged, came in 2 cars. Said they were old friends having a reunion weekend. All women. But there were 2 men in here. He frowned. "You sure?" "Positive. I saw them myself. 2 men, 2 women. Then somebody else must have come later. But I didn't see any additional vehicles when I drove up." The county sheriff arrived around 3 in the morning, along with 2 deputies. Sheriff Anderson was a tall, lean man in his 50s who'd been in law enforcement for 30 years. He took my statement first, having me walk him through everything from the moment I heard the sound outside the office until the ambulances left. He took notes in a small pad, asking clarifying questions, his face giving away nothing. Then he and his deputies examined cabin 9 for over an hour. I stayed at the office with Bernard, both of us nursing strong coffee and trying to make sense of what had happened. Guests from other cabins had started emerging, drawn by the commotion. Bernard went out to reassure them that everything was under control, that there was no danger to anyone else on the property. I wasn't so sure about that, but I kept my doubts to myself. Sheriff Anderson returned to the office just as the sky was beginning to lighten in the east. He looked grim. "The hospital called," he said without preamble. "All 4 victims are alive, but they're in critical condition. The doctors say they were poisoned. Deliberate poisoning, not food that went bad. They found high concentrations of herbicide and rodenticide in their systems. Weed killer and rat poison." Bernard's face went pale. "Someone poisoned them. That's what it looks like. We found the bottles in the cabin's trash, both empty. Someone mixed it into the food or drinks, probably the wine based on residue we found in the glasses." I felt sick to my stomach. But why? Who would do that? The sheriff consulted his notes. Here's where it gets interesting. The cabin was registered to a woman named Judith Monroe. Address in Washington State. According to the credit card receipt, she paid for the full weekend. But when we contacted the hospital to get information about the victims, we found out that Judith Monroe isn't one of the 4 people we transported. The victims are Lisa Chen, Robert Patterson, Angela Foster, and James Wong. All of them live in Montana, and according to their initial statements, what little they could give us, Judith Monroe was the one who organized this reunion. She invited them all here. "So where is she?" Bernard asked. "That's the question. Her car is gone. A blue Honda Civic registered in her name. We found the phone line to cabin 9 had been cut, probably so the victims couldn't call for help from inside. Based on the timeline the hospital gave us for when the poisoning likely occurred, we think she fed them dinner around 7, waited until the poison started taking effect, then drove away. The implications were staggering. This wasn't an accident or a case of contaminated food. Someone had deliberately poisoned 4 people, watched them begin to die, and then calmly left them to suffer. If that man hadn't managed to crawl to the office, if I hadn't found them when I did, they all would have died in that cabin. "Do you know why she did it?" I asked. Sheriff Anderson shook his head. "Not yet. We've contacted authorities in Washington to bring her in for questioning. But from what the victims told the doctors, this was supposed to be a friendly reunion. They hadn't seen each other in years. They were all college friends back in the 90s, lost touch after graduation. Then Judith reached out a few months ago, suggested they all get together. They thought it was a nice gesture. The sun rose over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. It seemed wrong somehow that the world could be so beautiful after such an awful night. Sheriff Anderson and his deputies were still processing the scene at cabin 9, photographing evidence, bagging bottles and plates, measuring distances. News vans started showing up around 8 o'clock, having caught wind of the story from their police scanners. Bernard dealt with them, giving brief statements, and asking them to respect the privacy of the other guests. I was finally allowed to leave around 9 in the morning, exhausted and traumatized. The day porter Thomas arrived for his shift and immediately started asking questions. I gave him the basics but left out most of the details. I didn't want to relive it all again so soon. Driving home through the morning light, I couldn't stop thinking about those 4 people. They'd come to Montana expecting a happy reunion with an old friend. Instead, they'd been poisoned and left to die in a remote cabin far from any help. If the symptoms had progressed just a bit faster, if that man hadn't managed to crawl to the office, if I'd been on break or in the bathroom when he arrived. My mother was waiting for me when I got home. Somehow she'd already heard about what happened. Small-town gossip traveled faster than any news broadcast. She made me breakfast and listened while I told her the whole story, then sent me to bed despite it being mid-morning. I didn't think I'd be able to sleep, but exhaustion won out, and I was unconscious within minutes. I woke up in the early evening to find my mother in the living room, watching the news. Judith Monroe's face filled the television screen. A driver's license photo showing a pleasant-looking woman in her mid-40s with short brown hair and a slight smile. The news anchor was saying that she'd been apprehended by Washington State Police at a rest stop on Interstate 90, approximately 6 hours after the poisoning had been reported. She'd been charged with 4 counts of attempted murder. They're saying she confessed, my mother said quietly. Told the police she'd been planning it for months. Something about a grudge from college. Something that happened back in the 90s that she never got over. Can you imagine holding on to anger for that long? I couldn't. But then again, before last night, I couldn't have imagined a lot of things. I returned to work 3 days later. Bernard offered to give me time off. Said he'd understand if I wanted to quit entirely. But I needed the money, and didn't want to let fear control my choices. Besides, what were the odds of something like that happening again? The media attention died down after a week. Judith Monroe pleaded guilty to 4 counts of attempted murder, and was sentenced to 35 years in prison. The 4 victims all survived, though they spent weeks recovering in the hospital. One of them, Angela Foster, suffered permanent kidney damage from the poison. They all moved out of state afterward, wanting to put Montana and the whole terrible experience behind them. Bernard had Cabin 9 professionally cleaned and decontaminated, but he could never bring himself to rent it out again. It sat empty for the rest of the season, and the following spring he had it demolished. He built a new cabin on a different part of the property and never assigned the number 9 to any structure again. As for me, I worked at Pine Ridge Cabins for another 2 years before heading off to college. I never watched Hellraiser again, couldn't bring myself to finish it after that night. But I learned some important lessons about human nature, about how ordinary situations can turn deadly in an instant, and about the importance of paying attention to those instincts that tell you something isn't right. Sometimes I still think about that night. About the man rising up at the window with blood and poison staining his face. About the smell in Cabin 9. About how close 4 people came to dying while I sat watching a horror movie 50 yards away. I think about how a simple reunion among old friends became a nightmare because one person couldn't let go of the past. And I think about all the other cabins I watched over during those years. All the reunions and celebrations and quiet weekends that happened without incident. Most people are good. Most gatherings are exactly what they appear to be. But sometimes in the mountains of Montana, on a cold October night, evil comes wearing the face of an old friend, and survival comes down to nothing more than luck and a night porter who happened to be paying attention at exactly the right moment. I'll carry that knowledge with me for the rest of my life. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the vast, empty expanse of the desert. It was the kind of quiet that you only find miles away from civilization, where even the wind seems to whisper instead of howl. My name is Damian Trejo, and what I'm about to tell you happened last year, in 2023. You see, I've always had this itch for adventure, a knack for finding myself in situations that most would avoid. Comes from growing up on the wrong side of the tracks, I guess. Life's hardships made me tougher, more willing to take risks. Some might call it foolish, but I've always thought of it as living life on the edge. I had just finished a cross-country road trip, exploring all the oddball attractions and hidden gems the US has to offer. This day was supposed to be my final stretch. Heading back to Los Angeles from a small, unremarkable town in Nevada, I decided to take a detour through the remote stretches of the Mojave Desert. Something about the endless sand and isolation called to me. I wanted to end my trip with one last thrill. The landscape was a stark contrast to the bustling cities I'd passed through. Miles and miles of nothing but sand, scrub, and the occasional jagged rock formation. The only sign of human presence was the narrow, winding road beneath my tires. I was in my old, beat-up Jeep Cherokee, the kind of car that feels like an extension of yourself after so many miles together. As I drove, my mind wandered to the events that led me here. Growing up in East LA wasn't easy. My old man split when I was young, leaving my mom to raise 3 kids on her own. We didn't have much, but we had each other. I learned early on that life doesn't hand you anything. You've got to reach out and grab it yourself. That's what this road trip was all about. After years of working dead-end jobs, saving every penny I could, I finally had enough to take some time off and see the country. It was my way of proving to myself, and maybe to the world, that I could do something extraordinary. The radio crackled with static, cutting in and out as I passed through areas of weak signal, I didn't mind. The silence of the desert was its own kind of music. As the last rays of sunlight faded, I flicked on my headlights, illuminating the empty road ahead. Just as the sky turned that deep blue twilight, I noticed something in the distance. At first, it looked like a mirage, a flicker of movement against the stillness of the desert. But as I got closer, I realized it was a person. Or rather, what I thought was a person. I pulled over, curiosity piqued. There was a man, tall and gaunt, with a tattered flannel shirt and jeans that had seen better days. He was waving me down with a frantic urgency that set my nerves on edge. I'm no stranger to helping folks in need, but something about this felt off. Maybe it was the isolation, or the way the darkness seemed to close in around us. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to step into something I couldn't easily back out of. "Hey, you all right?" I called out, stepping out of my Jeep. The man didn't respond immediately. He just kept looking over his shoulder, like he was being chased by something unseen. Little did I know, this encounter would be the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt me for the rest of my life. "I need help," he stammered finally, his voice dry and cracked. Something's out there. It's coming for me." Now, I'm not one to believe in ghost stories or desert legends, but the fear in his eyes was real enough. I helped him into the passenger seat and got back behind the wheel. "What's out there?" I asked as we sped down the road, but he just kept muttering about something big, something monstrous. I chalked it up to dehydration and exposure. Maybe he'd been out in the sun too long, hallucinating. As we drove, I tried to get more information out of him. "What's your name?" I asked, hoping to calm him down. "Ben," he replied, his eyes darting frantically from the rearview mirror to the side windows.
Ben Hawkins. I was camping. Wanted to get away from it all, you know?
I nodded, understanding the appeal all too well. "So what happened out there, Ben?" He shook his head, as if trying to clear his thoughts. "It started with noises. At first I thought it was just the wind, or maybe some coyotes. But then I saw it." "Saw what?" I pressed, my curiosity getting the better of me. Ben turned to me, his eyes wide with terror. Something that shouldn't exist. Something not human. I was about to ask for more details when the Jeep started to sputter. I cursed under my breath. This old clunker had never let me down before. But now of all times it decided to act up. I pulled over and popped the hood, hoping it was something simple. Ben started to panic. No, we can't stop. It's here," he screamed, scrambling out of the car. I looked around, trying to see what he was so terrified of. That's when I heard it, a low rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. My heart raced as I turned towards the sound. Emerging from the shadows of a rocky outcrop was something I couldn't quite comprehend. It was massive, standing at least 8 feet tall, covered in matted fur. Its limbs were long and muscular, ending in hands that looked almost human, but with claws that could tear through flesh with ease. Its face was what truly sent a chill down my spine, a twisted amalgamation of human and animal features, with eyes that gleamed with an unnatural intelligence. Ben bolted, screaming into the night. The creature turned its gaze on him, and in 2 strides it was upon him. I heard his screams cut short, replaced by a sickening crunch. My instinct was to run, but my legs felt like lead. I fumbled with the keys, trying to get back in the Jeep, but the engine wouldn't turn over. I grabbed the tire iron from the back seat and faced the creature. It dropped Ben's lifeless body and turned its attention to me. In that moment, I knew I was staring down death itself, but I wasn't going to go down without a fight. "Come on, you ugly bastard," I yelled, swinging the tire iron. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. The creature lunged at me, swiping with its massive claws. I dodged barely, feeling the rush of air as its claws passed inches from my face. I struck out with the tire iron, hitting it in the side. It let out a roar of pain, but it was more angry than hurt. We danced this deadly dance for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Each swing, each dodge took more out of me. My muscles screamed in protest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer. As I fought, my mind raced. What was this thing? How could something like this exist? I'd heard stories of cryptids and monsters before, but I'd always dismissed them as tall tales. Now, face to face with this nightmare, I realized how wrong I'd been. The creature's eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I saw something there beyond mere animal instinct. There was intelligence, and worse, there was malice. This wasn't just a predator hunting for food. It was enjoying the chase, savoring my fear. I stumbled, my foot catching on a rock, and I went down hard. The tire iron flew from my grasp, clattering away into the darkness. This was it, I thought. This is how I die, torn apart by some monster in the middle of nowhere. Just when I thought it was over, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. "Another car coming down the road," I shouted, waving my arms trying to get their attention. The creature seemed momentarily distracted by the lights, and I took the chance to scramble back into the Jeep. The other car screeched to a halt, and two men jumped out, armed with rifles. They took one look at the creature and opened fire. The sound of the gunshots echoed through the desert, and the creature let out a howl of pain and rage. It turned and fled into the darkness, leaving me gasping for breath and covered in sweat. The two men approached cautiously, keeping their rifles trained on the shadows where the creature had disappeared. One of them, an older man with a grizzled beard, turned to me. "You all right, son?" he asked, his voice gruff but concerned. "Yeah," I managed to choke out. "Thanks. What the hell was that thing?" The other man, younger but with the same weathered look, answered. "Bigfoot," he said simply. "We've been hunting it for years. Thought we'd lost it, but looks like it found you instead." I nodded, too exhausted to argue. They helped me get my Jeep running again, and I followed them back to their cabin, a small, fortified shack in the middle of nowhere. As we drove, I couldn't shake the image of the creature from my mind. Its eyes, intelligent and cruel, haunted me. I had a feeling this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The cabin was small but sturdy, built to withstand both the harsh desert elements and, apparently, the attacks of monstrous creatures. As we entered, I noticed the walls were lined with maps, newspaper clippings, and blurry photographs. It looked like something out of a conspiracy theorist's dream. The two men introduced themselves as Jeb and Roy, brothers who'd made it their mission to track down the creature after it had killed their father years ago. Jeb, the older one, moved with a slight limp. "A souvenir," he said, "from his first encounter with the beast." "So," I said as Roy handed me a steaming mug of coffee. "You're telling me that thing out there is actually Bigfoot? Like the Bigfoot?" Jeb nodded grimly. "That's right, though what we're dealing with ain't exactly the gentle giant from the stories. It's a killer," Roy added, his voice hard. "Has been for decades. Our pa was just one of many." I listened as they told me their story. Their father had been a park ranger, well respected in the community. One night he went out on a routine patrol and never came back. When they found his body, or what was left of it, the official report blamed it on a bear attack. "But we knew better," Jeb said. "The claw marks, the footprints, no bear did that." From that day on, they dedicated their lives to hunting the creature, to preventing others from suffering the same fate as their father. They showed me their research. Years of compiled data on sightings, attack patterns, and possible lairs. "It's smart," Roy explained. "Knows how to cover its tracks, how to disappear when the heat's on. But we're getting closer. Tonight proved that." As the night wore on, we talked strategy. They were convinced the creature would be back, drawn by the scent of blood and the thrill of the hunt. We needed to be ready. "There's more you should know," Jeb said, his voice low. "This thing, it ain't natural. Way it moves, way it thinks. There's something else going on here." "What do you mean?" I asked, a chill running down my spine. Roy leaned in, his eyes intense. "We think someone, or something, made it, created it on purpose. The implications of that were almost too much to process. If they were right, if this creature was some kind of engineered monster, then who created it? And why?" As we prepared for what might come, fortifying the cabin and checking our weapons, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled into something much bigger and more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. The desert night closed in around us, and somewhere out there I knew the creature was waiting, watching, planning its next move. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind outside had me on edge. I kept seeing those eyes, intelligent and malevolent, every time I closed mine. Jeb and Roy took turns keeping watch, their rifles never far from reach. I offered to take a shift, but they insisted I rest. "You've been through enough," Jeb said. "Besides, you'll need your strength if that thing comes back." As I lay there trying to quiet my racing thoughts, I couldn't help but reflect on how I'd ended up here. Just yesterday, I was a guy on a road trip, looking for one last adventure before heading home. Now I was holed up in a cabin with two monster hunters, waiting for a creature that shouldn't exist to come and try to kill us. Life has a funny way of taking unexpected turns. Around 3 a.m., I was startled awake by a low rumbling sound. At first I thought it was thunder, but the sky outside was clear, stars twinkling coldly in the darkness. "It's here," Roy whispered, his face grim in the dim light of the cabin. We moved silently, taking up prearranged positions, Jeb by the front door, Roy at the back, and me by the single window, a shotgun in my hands that felt both alien and somehow right. The sound came again, closer this time, a deep guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest, so loud I was sure the creature must be able to hear it. Then, silence. The kind of silence that presses against your ears, that makes every breath sound like a shout. We waited, tense, ready for anything. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Suddenly, there was a crash from the roof. Something heavy landed above us, and dust rained down from the ceiling. Claws scraped against wood as the creature moved. "It's trying to find a way in," Jeb hissed. The scratching stopped, and for a moment all was quiet again. Then, without warning, a massive arm smashed through the window next to me, claws grasping blindly in the darkness. I stumbled back, firing the shotgun on instinct. The blast was deafening in the confines of the cabin, and the arm withdrew with a roar of pain and rage. "Did you get it?" Roy shouted. Before I could answer, the entire front wall of the cabin exploded inward. The creature stood there, framed in the wreckage, its eyes gleaming with fury. In the light cast by our lamps, I could see dark blood matting its fur where my shot had hit. Jeb and Roy opened fire, their rifles cracking in the night. The creature howled, more in anger than pain, and charged forward. What followed was chaos. Gunshots, splintering wood, the creature's roars, and our own shouts all blended together in a cacophony of violence. I fired again and again, the recoil of the shotgun bruising my shoulder. The creature seemed to be everywhere at once, its massive form filling the small cabin. A swipe of its arm sent Roy flying across the room. Jeb emptied his rifle into its chest, but it kept coming. I was knocked to the ground, the shotgun skittering away. The creature loomed over me, its hot breath on my face, jaws opened wide to reveal rows of razor-sharp teeth. This is it, I thought. This is how I die. But then, just as the creature was about to strike, a new sound cut through the chaos. A high-pitched, piercing wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The creature recoiled, its hands clawing at its ears. It let out a roar of what sounded like pain, and then, to my utter shock, it turned and fled, disappearing into the night as quickly as it had appeared. As the dust settled, I looked around the devastated cabin. Jeb was helping Roy to his feet, both of them battered but alive. What was that sound?" I asked, my voice shaking. Jeb shook his head, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. "I don't know, but whatever it was, it saved our lives." As the adrenaline began to fade, I realized this was far from over. The creature was still out there, and now, it seemed, there were other forces at play. Forces we didn't understand. The long night was over, but I had a feeling the real battle was just beginning. As the first light of dawn broke over the desert, we surveyed the damage. The cabin was a wreck, barely standing. We were alive but battered and shaken. Roy had a nasty gash on his arm where the creature had caught him, and Jeb was nursing what looked like a couple of broken ribs. I was bruised all over, but somehow had avoided any serious injuries. While Roy patched himself up, Jeb and I salvaged what we could from the wreckage. As we worked, I couldn't shake the question swirling in my mind. "That sound," I said, breaking the tense silence. "The one that drove the creature away. Any ideas what it could have been?" Jeb paused, his face clouded with thought. In all our years hunting this thing, we've never encountered anything like that. But he hesitated, as if unsure whether to continue. But what? I pressed. He sighed. There've been rumors, whispers about government involvement. Some say they created the creature as some kind of super soldier experiment gone wrong. Others think they're trying to capture it for study. It sounded far-fetched, like something out of a bad sci-fi movie. But after what I'd seen, I was ready to believe almost anything. So you think that it could have been them? I asked. Jeb nodded grimly. It's possible. If they've been tracking the creature, they might have developed some kind of sonic weapon to control it. The implications were staggering. If the government was involved, how deep did this go? And what did it mean for us? As the sun climbed higher in the sky, we made a decision. We couldn't stay here. The cabin was compromised, and we were too exposed. We needed to move, to find somewhere safer to regroup and plan our next move. We packed what supplies we could into my Jeep and Jeb's old pickup truck. As we were about to leave, Roy emerged from the cabin holding a battered metal box. Almost forgot this, he said, his voice grim. It's time you saw what we're really up against. Inside the box were files, photographs, and what looked like medical reports. As I flipped through them, my blood ran cold. There were images of the creature in various stages of development, charts detailing genetic modifications, and reports of field tests that read like horror stories. Where did you get all this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Our Pa, Roy explained. Before he was killed, he stumbled onto something big. These files were his insurance policy. He sent them to us, told us to keep them safe. It was all there in black and white. The creature wasn't some natural anomaly or cryptid. It was a product of human engineering, a weapon designed to be the perfect predator. As we drove away from the ruins of the cabin, I felt the weight of this new knowledge settling on my shoulders. We weren't just fighting a monster anymore. We were up against something much bigger, much more dangerous. And somewhere out there, both the creature and its creators were waiting for us. We drove for hours, sticking to back roads and avoiding populated areas. The desert stretched endlessly around us, a sea of sand and scrub broken only by the occasional rocky outcropping. Despite the harsh sun beating down, I felt a chill that went bone deep. Jeb led the way in his pickup, with Roy riding shotgun. I followed close behind in my Jeep, my mind racing as I tried to process everything I'd learned. The files we'd recovered painted a picture more terrifying than I could have imagined. The creature, officially designated Project Apex in the documents, was the result of decades of secret research. They had combined DNA from various predators with a human base, creating something that was both terrifyingly intelligent and savagely strong. But it had escaped, turning on its creators and fleeing into the wilderness. As we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every distant sound making me flinch. Around midday, we pulled over in a secluded canyon to rest and plan our next move. As we huddled in the scant shade provided by a large boulder, Jeb spread out a map. There's an old military bunker about 50 miles from here, he said, pointing to a spot on the map. It's been abandoned for years, but it should be secure enough for us to hole up and figure out our next move. Roy nodded in agreement. It's our best bet. We need somewhere defensible, somewhere we can... He was cut off by a sound that made my blood run cold. A low rumbling growl, followed by the scrape of claws on stone. We all froze, eyes darting around trying to locate the source of the sound. That's when I saw it. Perched on top of the boulder we were sheltering under. Its massive form silhouetted against the sky was the creature. Run, Jeb yelled, already scrambling towards the vehicles. But the creature was faster. It leapt down, landing between us and our escape. Its eyes, those terrifyingly intelligent eyes, swept over us. I could swear I saw a glimmer of recognition when it looked at me. What happened next was a blur of action and terror. Roy managed to get off a shot with his rifle, the bullet grazing the creature's shoulder. It roared in pain and fury, charging towards him. Jeb and I split up, trying to flank it. I had a pistol Jeb had given me, but it felt woefully inadequate against this monster. The creature was a whirlwind of claws and fangs. It caught Roy with a swipe of its massive arm, sending him flying. He hit the ground hard and didn't get up. "Roy," Jeb screamed, emptying his rifle into the creature's back. It turned, faster than something that size should be able to move, and lunged at Jeb. I fired my pistol, the shot seeming pitifully small against the creature's bulk. But then, just as it was about to reach Jeb, that sound came again. The high-pitched wail that had driven it off before. The creature roared in what sounded like agony, clawing at its ears. From behind a nearby ridge, a group of figures emerged. They were dressed in black tactical gear, faces hidden behind masks. Each carried what looked like some kind of high-tech rifle. The creature, clearly in pain from the sonic assault, turned and fled, disappearing into the desert with incredible speed. As the sound faded, the figures approached us. The one in the lead removed his mask, revealing a face that was all hard angles and cold eyes. "Mr. Trejo," he said, his voice carrying an air of authority, "we need to talk." The man who had addressed me gestured for his team to secure the area. Two of them went to check on Roy, who was starting to stir. "Who are you?" I demanded, my gun still raised. "How do you know my name?" The man's expression didn't change. "My name is Agent Keller. I'm with a specialized division of the government. We've been tracking you since your encounter with the asset last night." "The asset?" Jeb spat, helping Roy to his feet. "Is that what you call that monster?" Keller's eyes narrowed. "That monster, as you call it, is a highly classified military project, one that you've become entangled with, much to our inconvenience." My mind was reeling. The files we'd found, the creature's unnatural abilities, the high-tech equipment these men carried. It was all starting to fall into place. "You created it, didn't you?" I said, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. "And now you can't control it." For a moment I thought I saw a flicker of something, regret maybe, in Keller's eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "What we created," he said slowly, "was meant to be the ultimate soldier. Stronger, faster, and smarter than any human. But yes, we underestimated its capabilities." Roy let out a bitter laugh. "Underestimated? It's been killing people for years. Our father was an unfortunate casualty." Keller cut him off, "as were many others. But now we have a chance to end this, to contain the asset once and for all. And you three are going to help us do it." I exchanged glances with Jeb and Roy. We were outnumbered and outgunned. But more than that, I could see in their eyes the same realization I had come to. This might be our only chance to stop the creature for good. "What do you need us to do?" I asked. Keller nodded, seemingly satisfied. "The asset has formed a connection with you, Mr. Trejo. It recognizes you from your encounter. We can use that." As Keller laid out the plan, I felt a mix of emotions washing over me. Fear, anger, determination. This wasn't the adventure I had set out for when I started my road trip, but it was the one I had found, and now, for better or worse, I was seeing it through to the end. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desert, we prepared for what would likely be our final confrontation with the creature. The hunt that had begun with it pursuing me would end with us pursuing it. In the fading light, I caught a glimpse of movement on a distant ridge. For a moment, I thought I saw a pair of eyes watching us. Intelligent, calculating eyes. Then it was gone. The final chase was about to begin, and only one hunter would emerge victorious. The confrontation with the creature, the asset, played out in a haze of gunfire, blood and that ear-piercing sonic weapon. In the end, we managed to subdue it, but at a cost. Roy didn't make it, sacrificing himself to give us the opening we needed. Jeb was badly injured, but alive. As for me, I walked away with scars both physical and mental that I knew would never fully heal. Keller and his team took the creature away in a heavily armored vehicle. They offered me a job, said my unique experience made me a valuable asset. I turned them down. I'd seen enough of their world to last a lifetime. Instead, I hit the road again. But this time, it wasn't adventure I was seeking. It was a way to make sense of everything that had happened. Everything I'd learned about the hidden dangers lurking in the shadows of our world. Sometimes, late at night in some nameless motel room, I swear I can hear that low rumbling growl. I see those intelligent eyes watching me from the darkness, and I wonder if it's really over, or if somewhere out there the creature is still waiting, still hunting. But then I remember what I've been through, what I've survived, and I know that whatever comes next, whatever nightmares are still out there waiting to be discovered, I'll be ready. Because now I know the truth. The world is stranger and more dangerous than most people could ever imagine, and sometimes the real monsters aren't the ones with claws and fangs, but the ones who create them. As I drive down another empty highway, the desert stretching endlessly around me, I can't help but smile, because despite everything, despite the terror and the loss, I'm still here, still moving forward. The road ahead is long and full of unknowns, but then again, isn't that what adventure is all about? The rhythmic hum of tires on asphalt filled the cab of my beat-up Ford F-150 as we cruised down a winding road, deep in the heart of the Ozarks. The lush green canopy of trees stretched endlessly on either side, occasionally broken by rocky outcroppings that hinted at the rugged terrain beyond. Man, if you told me I'd be stuck in the middle of nowhere with a dead body and a Bigfoot story, I would have laughed in your face. That's what I keep thinking as I sit here, hands trembling, trying to make sense of the nightmare I've just lived through. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up a bit. My name's Darian Thorpe, and this all happened back in 2017. I've had my fair share of rough patches in life. My parents split when I was a kid, and I bounced between them like a pinball, never really finding solid ground. Maybe that's why I developed such a knack for fixing cars. They were the only thing that didn't argue back or leave. I'd like to think I'm pretty handy with a wrench, and it's served me well over the years. Anyway, this story really starts with Milo, my best friend since high school. We were inseparable, like brothers really. He had this infectious laugh and a tendency to joke about everything, even when things got serious. We'd always talked about going on a road trip, just to get away from it all. Life had been wearing us down, and we needed an escape. So there we were, cruising down that lonely road, Milo's grin wider than the highway itself. "Dude, this is it," he exclaimed, punching my arm playfully. "No cell signal, no noise, just nature and us. It's gonna be epic." I couldn't help but smile. His enthusiasm was contagious, even if I had my reservations about spending a week in the wilderness. Yeah, I chuckled. Just remember whose mechanical expertise is gonna save our asses if this rust bucket breaks down. We were headed to an old cabin. Milo's uncle had left him. It was tucked away in a part of the Ozarks that time seemed to have forgotten. The perfect spot for two guys looking to disconnect from the world for a while. As we drove deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around us. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, creating a dappled pattern on the road. It was beautiful, in a wild, untamed sort of way. But there was something else too, a feeling I couldn't quite shake, like we were being watched. I glanced at Milo, wondering if he felt it too, but he was too busy fiddling with the radio, trying to find a station that wasn't pure static. "Man, we really are in the boonies," he laughed, giving up and switching it off. Little did I know, as we wound our way deeper into the forest, that this trip would change our lives forever, that somewhere in these woods, something was waiting, something that would turn our dream vacation into a waking nightmare. The cabin came into view as we rounded a bend. A rustic structure that looked like it had been standing there since the dawn of time. Milo let out a whoop of excitement, but I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something about this place, something that made my skin crawl. If only I'd listened to that feeling. If only we'd turned back right then and there. But we didn't. We parked the truck, unloaded our gear, and stepped into a horror story of our own making. As I look back now, I can't help but wonder, how different would things have been if we'd just stayed home? But it's too late for what-ifs now. All I can do is tell our story, and hope that someone somewhere learns from our mistake. Because out there in the wilderness where the trees grow thick and the shadows run deep, something is waiting, and God help you if it finds you. We got to the cabin around noon. It was rustic, to put it mildly. The wooden structure looked like it had weathered 100 storms, its dark timber bleached by years of sun and rain. The porch sagged slightly, and the windows stared out at us like vacant eyes. Milo laughed and said, "Home sweet home, eh? Bet it's got hot running water and room service." I chuckled and we started unpacking. The interior of the cabin was just as rough as the outside. A layer of dust covered everything, and the air was thick with the musty smell of disuse. But it was shelter, and it beat sleeping in tents. We spent the afternoon setting up and exploring the area. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by dense forest. A narrow path led down to a creek about a quarter-mile away. Milo found an old fire pit near the front of the cabin, and we decided to gather some wood to get a fire going before it got dark. As the sun dipped below the tree line, casting long shadows across the clearing, we sat around the crackling fire, sharing stories and beers. The night was peaceful, the only sounds the pop and hiss of the fire and the chorus of crickets in the underbrush. It was then that Milo started with his Bigfoot nonsense. He had this goofy grin, saying, "Man, can you imagine if Bigfoot just showed up right now? We'd be internet famous." I rolled my eyes. "Yeah, and we'd invite him for a drink. Seriously, enough with the Bigfoot crap." But Milo was on a roll. "No, really. Think about it. All these sightings over the years, there's gotta be something out there, right? And we're in prime Bigfoot territory." I was about to tell him to knock it off when we heard a rustling noise coming from the woods. Milo, being Milo, yelled, "Come on out, Bigfoot. We got cold beer." We laughed it off, thinking it was just a raccoon or something. But the rustling got closer and louder. We stood up, flashlights in hand, scanning the tree line. The light caught something moving, something big. "Milo, get back," I whispered, but he was already stepping forward, curious. "Holy shit. Is that?" He never finished the sentence. It happened so fast. One moment, Milo was standing there, flashlight beam dancing across the trees. The next, a massive figure burst from the underbrush, all fur and muscle and terrifying speed. I saw it clearly in the firelight. A creature standing at least 7 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of ape and man, with deep-set eyes that reflected the firelight like a predator's. Milo screamed, a sound of pure terror that I'll never forget. The creature rushed at him, quicker than anything that big should be able to move. I froze, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. The thing grabbed Milo, massive hands engulfing his torso. There was a sickening crunch, and Milo's scream cut off abruptly. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the fire poker and swung it like a madman. The iron bar connected with a meaty thud. The creature roared, a sound so deep and primal it shook me to my core. It dropped Milo and turned those dark, unreadable eyes on me. For a second, I thought I was dead. I could smell its breath, hot and rank, feel the heat radiating off its massive body. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, it bolted back into the woods, leaving me alone with my dying friend. Milo was a mess, blood everywhere, gasping for air. I tried to stop the bleeding, pressing my hands against the worst of the wounds, but it was like trying to hold back a flood with my bare hands. He looked at me, eyes wide with fear and pain, and whispered, "You?" Those were his last words. He went limp in my arms, and just like that, my best friend was gone. Part of me wanted to run, to jump in the truck and drive until I hit civilization. But I couldn't leave Milo, not like this. I knew I had to do something, so I steeled myself and dragged his body back to the cabin, my mind racing. Once inside, I locked the door and barred it with whatever I could find. Chairs, the small table, anything to create a barrier between me and whatever was out there. I didn't sleep, just sat there in the dark, waiting for that thing to come back. The night dragged on endlessly. Every noise outside made me jump. The crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves. I kept thinking about Milo's stupid Bigfoot jokes and how they weren't so funny now. As I sat there covered in my best friend's blood, I realized that we had stumbled into something beyond our understanding. Whatever was out there, it wasn't the friendly, misunderstood creature of campfire stories. It was a killer, and I was trapped in its territory. The hours crawled by like wounded animals. Every creak of the cabin's old timber, every gust of wind through the trees outside sent my heart racing. I sat with my back against the door, the fire poker clutched in my white-knuckled grip, straining my ears for any sound that might indicate the creature's return. Milo's body lay where I'd left it, covered with a blanket I'd found in one of the musty cabinets. I couldn't bring myself to look at it. The reality of what had happened was still too raw, too horrific to fully comprehend. As the night wore on, my mind began to play tricks on me. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of the room. More than once I thought I heard heavy breathing just outside the cabin walls. Each time I'd tense up, ready to fight for my life, only to be met with silence. I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. The rational part of my brain insisted that it must have been a bear, maybe one with some kind of deformity that made it look more humanoid. But I knew that was bullshit. What I'd seen was no bear. It was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky outside, I finally allowed myself to relax slightly. Somehow I'd made it through the night, but I knew I couldn't stay here. I had to get out, had to tell someone what had happened. With shaking hands, I began to gather our belongings, shoving them haphazardly into our bags. I avoided looking at Milo's things, each item a painful reminder of the friend I'd lost. When I could delay no longer, I turned to Milo's body. I couldn't leave him here. Not like this. With a heavy heart, I wrapped him in the blanket and, summoning all my strength, lifted him into my arms. The morning air was crisp and cool as I stepped outside, my eyes darting nervously around the clearing. There was no sign of the creature, but I could feel its presence in every shadow, behind every tree. I loaded Milo's body into the back of the truck, covering it with a tarp we'd brought for camping. I took one last look at the cabin, wondering if I'd ever come back. I doubted it. As I climbed into the driver's seat, a movement in the trees caught my eye. For a split second I saw it, a large dark shape watching me from the shadows. Then it was gone, melting back into the forest as if it had never been there at all. I gunned the engine and tore out of there, gravel spitting from beneath the tires. As the cabin receded in my rearview mirror, I felt a mix of relief and dread. I was escaping, yes, but I was also leaving the only place where I knew for certain that the creature existed. Would anyone believe me once I got back to civilization? As I drove, I rehearsed what I would tell the authorities, but no matter how I phrased it, the story sounded insane. A Bigfoot attack. They'd think I was crazy, or worse, that I had something to do with Milo's death. The truth was a burden I now had to bear, a secret that would haunt me for the rest of my days, and as the miles rolled by, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that somehow, someday, I would find myself face to face with that creature again. I drove like a madman to the nearest town, about an hour away. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the truck on the road. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see that thing loping after us, those dark eyes fixed on me. The town, when I finally reached it, seemed surreal in its normalcy. People were going about their day, completely oblivious to the horror I'd just lived through. I found a payphone outside a gas station and called the cops, trying to keep it together as I explained what had happened. When they arrived, I told them everything. Well, almost everything. I left out the part about the creature being Bigfoot. I'm not stupid. I knew how that would sound. Instead, I described it as a large, unidentified animal. Even then, I could see the doubt in their eyes. They took Milo's body and started an investigation. I was questioned for hours, going over every detail again and again. The more I talked, the more I could see them losing interest in my story. They kept coming back to one question. Had Milo and I been drinking? Yes, we'd had a few beers. No, we weren't drunk. Yes, I was sure about what I saw. No, I couldn't explain why there were no other signs of a large animal in the area. The cops didn't find anything at the cabin. No footprints. No signs of struggle. Nothing to corroborate my story. They chalked it up to a bear attack, despite my protests. I knew what I saw, but who'd believe a Bigfoot story? Milo's death was ruled an accident, and I was left with nothing but questions and a whole lot of guilt. His family was devastated, and I couldn't even give them the truth about what had happened. How could I tell them their son was killed by a creature that wasn't supposed to exist? I went back to my life, fixing cars and trying to move on. But it's not something you can forget. I kept thinking about that night, about Milo and the creature. I don't tell people about it because it sounds insane, but every time I close my eyes, I see that thing, hear Milo's screams. The weeks following the incident were a blur of sleepless nights and paranoid days. I jumped at every shadow, flinched at every unexpected sound. I started researching Bigfoot sightings, spending hours online reading about encounters and theories. Some of what I found resonated with my experience, but much of it seemed like pure fantasy. I considered reaching out to Bigfoot researchers or cryptozoologists, but every time I got close to making contact, I stopped myself. What if they publicized my story? What if it somehow got back to that thing in the woods? The thought of it finding me, finishing what it started, was too terrifying to risk. So I kept quiet, carried my secret, and tried to convince myself that it was all a horrible nightmare. But deep down, I knew the truth. And I knew that somewhere out there, in the deep dark woods, that creature was still waiting. Months passed, and life took on a semblance of normalcy. I threw myself into my work, spending long hours at the garage, losing myself in the familiar rhythms of engines and tools. It was easier to focus on fixing cars than to dwell on the unfixable past. But the memories of that night never truly faded. They lurked in the back of my mind, ready to ambush me in quiet moments. I'd find myself staring off into space, reliving those terrifying seconds when the creature burst from the woods, the sound of Milo's bones cracking, the look in its eyes as it turned on me. I started having nightmares. In them I was back in those woods, but this time I was alone. I'd hear the creature moving in the darkness around me, always just out of sight. Sometimes I'd hear Milo's voice calling for help, but I could never find him. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, the phantom scent of pine and blood in my nostrils. My relationships suffered. How could I explain to anyone why I flinched at sudden movements? Why I refused to go camping or hiking? I became a hermit, withdrawing from friends and family. It was easier than trying to pretend everything was okay. I started drinking more than I should, using alcohol to numb the memories and help me sleep. It was a poor coping mechanism, I knew, but it was the only way I could find any peace. One night, about 6 months after the incident, I hit rock bottom. I was sitting in my apartment, halfway through a bottle of whiskey, when I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I was going to go back to those woods, confront that thing, make it pay for what it had done to Milo. I grabbed my keys and stumbled out to my truck. I was just about to start the engine when a moment of clarity hit me. This was suicide. Even if by some miracle I managed to find the creature, what could I possibly do against it? I sat there in the dark, key in the ignition. As the reality of my situation washed over me, I broke down, really broke down for the first time since that night. I cried for Milo, for myself, for the life I'd lost, and as the tears flowed, I made a decision. I couldn't go on like this. I needed help. The next day, I found a therapist. I couldn't tell her the whole truth, of course, but I talked about losing Milo, about the trauma of witnessing his death. It helped, more than I thought it would. Slowly, I started to piece my life back together. I quit drinking, started exercising, tried to reconnect with old friends. I even went on a few dates, though I never let anyone get too close. There was always a part of me that remained guarded, always watching the shadows. But as time passed, the nightmares became less frequent. The memories, while still painful, lost some of their sharp edges. I started to think that maybe, just maybe, I could put it all behind me. Then, almost a year to the day after Milo's death, I saw something that brought it all crashing back. It was just a brief news item, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. Another disappearance in the Ozarks, not far from where Milo and I had camped. The authorities were calling it a hiking accident, but I knew better. As I stared at the TV, a cold certainty settled in my gut. It wasn't over. The creature was still out there, and somehow, I knew our paths would cross again. 2 years after Milo's death, I found myself driving back to the Ozarks. I hadn't planned it, hadn't even realized where I was going until I saw the familiar landscape rolling by outside my window. It was as if some unseen force was pulling me back to where it all began. I told myself I was being stupid, that I should turn around and go home. But a part of me knew this was inevitable. I'd been running from the truth for too long. It was time to face it. The road to the cabin was overgrown now, barely visible in places. My truck struggled over the uneven terrain, but I pressed on. As I neared the clearing, my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The cabin looked exactly the same, as if the last 2 years had never happened. I half expected to see Milo step out onto the porch, grinning and ready with some stupid joke, but there was only silence and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I sat in the truck for a long time, wrestling with my fear. Finally, I took a deep breath and stepped out. The air was thick with the scent of pine and decaying leaves. I approached the cabin slowly, every sense on high alert. The interior was undisturbed, a thick layer of dust covering everything. Our sleeping bags were still there, rolled up in the corner where we'd left them. I picked up Milo's, a lump forming in my throat as I remembered his excitement about this trip. As the day wore on, I explored the area around the cabin. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Signs of the creature, maybe, or some evidence that would prove I wasn't crazy. But there was nothing. Just trees and rocks and the endless sounds of the forest. As night fell, I built a fire in the old pit, just like we had that night. I sat there, staring into the flames, lost in memories. That's when I heard it, a rustling in the underbrush, just like before. My heart nearly stopped. I stood up slowly, grabbing the fire poker. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Is someone there?" The rustling grew louder, closer. I gripped the fire poker tightly, my palms slick with sweat. Then, from the darkness beyond the firelight, a figure emerged. It wasn't the creature. It was a man, tall and lean, with a wild beard and piercing eyes. He held up his hands as he approached, showing he meant no harm. "Easy there, friend," he said, his voice gravelly. "Didn't mean to startle you." I lowered the poker slightly, but kept my guard up. "Who are you? What are you doing out here?" He introduced himself as Hank, a local who lived off the grid in these woods. He'd seen my fire and came to investigate. As we talked, I found myself telling him everything about Milo, the creature, the disbelief I'd faced. I expected him to laugh or call me crazy. Instead, he nodded solemnly. "You're not the first to see it," he said. "That thing's been out here for years. Most folks don't believe, but those of us who've seen it, we know." We talked long into the night. Hank shared stories of other sightings, of missing hikers and campers. He believed the creature was protecting its territory, lashing out at those who ventured too deep into the woods. As dawn broke, Hank left, but not before warning me to be careful. "It's still out there," he said, "and it remembers those who've crossed its path." I spent the next day hiking through the woods, retracing the steps Milo and I had taken 2 years ago. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. But I pressed on, driven by a need for closure I couldn't fully explain. As the sun began to set, I found myself in a small clearing I didn't recognize. The trees here were older, their branches forming a thick canopy overhead. The air felt different, heavier, charged with an energy I couldn't define. That's when I saw it. At first, just a shadow among shadows. Then it stepped forward, and I was face to face with the creature that had haunted my nightmares for 2 years. It was exactly as I remembered. Massive, covered in dark fur, with eyes that reflected an intelligence that sent chills down my spine. We stood there, locked in a silent standoff, neither moving. Finally, I found my voice. "Why?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness of my words. "Why did you kill him?" The creature tilted its head, almost quizzically. Then, to my utter shock, it spoke. The voice was deep, resonant, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. "Your kind threatens our existence," it said. "We protect what is ours." I was stunned, not just by the fact that it could speak, but by the implications of its words. "We?" I managed to ask. "There are more of you?" It nodded slowly. "Few, hidden, hunted." In that moment, everything I thought I knew shifted. This wasn't just some mindless beast. It was intelligent, part of a community, fighting for survival. "I'm sorry," I said, surprising myself. "We didn't know. We didn't mean any harm." The creature regarded me silently for a long moment. Then it turned and began to walk away. At the edge of the clearing, it paused and looked back. "Tell no one," it said, "or more will die." Then it was gone, melting into the forest as if it had never been there at all. I stood there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. Part of me wondered if I had imagined it all. But deep down, I knew it was real. As I made my way back to the cabin, I thought about Milo, about the life he'd lost. I thought about the creature and its kind, fighting to survive in a world that didn't believe they existed. And I thought about the burden of knowledge I now carried. I left the Ozarks the next morning, driving back to my life with a head full of questions and a heart heavy with secrets. I knew I could never share what I'd learned. The consequences would be too severe, not just for me, but for an entire species struggling to survive. Sometimes on quiet nights I find myself looking out into the darkness, wondering about the creatures hiding in the shadows of our world. I think about Milo, about the adventure we sought and the tragedy we found, and I hope that somehow, somewhere, he understands. I don't know what the future holds, or if I'll ever encounter the creature again, but I do know this. There are things in this world beyond our understanding, mysteries that defy explanation, and sometimes the truth is more terrifying and more wondrous than we could ever imagine. As for me, I'll keep my secret. I'll fix cars, live my life, and always keep one eye on the woods, because now I know what's out there. And in a strange way, I feel responsible for protecting not just humanity's secret, but the secret of an ancient hidden species fighting for survival in our ever-shrinking wilderness. Being a park ranger means being prepared for literally anything. We often wear many hats and act as communication between various service providers and authorities. We can be search and rescue specialists, emergency medical technicians, police officers, teachers, and sometimes even surrogate parents to lost children. The job demands that we always have our wits about us, or at least try to, and you develop a tolerance for certain sights, sounds, and smells depending on which branch of ranger work you specialize in. The Search and Rescue Division obviously deals with more grisly situations than most. When I first started this career 15 years ago, roadkill would make me gag, especially the putrid smell that rises from decomposing flesh on a hot summer day. The sweet cloying odor that seems to coat the inside of your nostrils and linger for hours afterward. While I by no means enjoy these encounters, I have simply grown accustomed to them. They become part of the job's landscape, like filing reports or maintaining trail markers. I have seen hikers who took catastrophic falls, their shin bones protruding through torn flesh at impossible angles. I have witnessed arms and ankles bent in directions that the human body was never designed to accommodate. There was even a car crash near the park's eastern boundary that required our assistance, since the highway patrol needed extra hands to collect the scattered remains across 200 yards of asphalt. That incident was particularly challenging, but at least there was a reasonable explanation when I handed a crime scene investigator a piece of human tissue that I could not immediately identify. What I discovered on what seemed like a routine patrol deep into the park's most remote section could not be so easily explained, and it continues to haunt my thoughts even now, months later. One aspect of this profession that I treasure most is the freedom it provides. While we all have designated responsibilities and territories, unless there is a specific emergency or scheduled event, we can travel to any section of our vast parkland and conduct our work there. The park encompasses over 40,000 acres of dense forest, winding rivers and rocky outcroppings that have remained largely unchanged for centuries. On that particular spring morning, I had chosen an especially remote location, precisely because it seldom receives visitors. These isolated areas sometimes reward us with sightings of wildlife that we can document and study, particularly some of our less populated species that prefer to avoid human contact. The wolves had been making a comeback in recent years, and there had been unconfirmed reports of mountain lion tracks near the northern ridges. There is no proper trail system in this section of the park. We maintain a rudimentary pathway for emergency access, but for the most part this territory is left to nature and allowed to grow wild and overgrown. It lies too far from civilization for adventurous school groups or scouting expeditions, and the majority of recreational hikers head in the opposite direction toward the more developed camping areas and scenic overlooks. The morning was still fairly cool despite the season, with that crisp quality that spring air possesses before the sun climbs high enough to generate real warmth. Dew clung to every surface, and my boots left clear impressions in the soft earth as I made my way deeper into the wilderness. The forest was alive with the sounds of awakening wildlife, birds calling to establish territory, small creatures rustling through the underbrush, and the distant sound of water moving over stones. I had been walking for approximately 2 hours, documenting various plant species and photographing potential wildlife habitats, when the smell first reached me. It was not immediately overwhelming, but distinct enough that I recognized it instantly. The metallic organic scent of blood. My training kicked in automatically, and I became more alert, scanning the surrounding area for signs of what might have occurred. Of course, I was not immediately alarmed by this discovery. We occasionally encounter bears in this region, along with other predators who hunt and consume their prey as part of the natural cycle. After all, this is genuine wilderness, where the laws of nature govern survival and death. I expected to find the remains of a deer, or perhaps evidence of a territorial dispute between competing predators. However, what I was completely unprepared to discover would challenge everything I thought I understood about this peaceful section of forest, and it would fundamentally alter my relationship with these woods that I had come to consider my second home. As I followed the increasingly strong scent of blood, pushing through a dense thicket of brambles that caught at my uniform and scratched at my exposed skin, I noticed that the normal forest sounds had grown eerily quiet. The birds had stopped their morning songs, and even the ever-present buzz of insects seemed muted. This unnatural silence should have served as a warning, but my curiosity and professional training compelled me to continue forward. The smell grew stronger with each step, that unmistakable copper tang that accompanies significant blood loss. I had encountered this odor before at accident scenes and during searches for injured hikers, but something about its intensity in this pristine wilderness setting felt wrong, almost unnatural. I pushed aside a final curtain of low-hanging branches and stepped into a small clearing that I had never seen before. Despite years of exploring this section of the park, the space was roughly circular, perhaps 20 feet in diameter, surrounded by towering oak and pine trees that seemed to lean inward, creating a natural amphitheater effect. And there, nailed to the thick trunk of the largest oak tree, was a human hand. The sight hit me like a physical blow, and I involuntarily took 2 steps backward, my breath catching in my throat. The hand had been severed at the wrist, not with the clean precision that would suggest surgical amputation, but with the ragged, brutal efficiency of someone using an axe or hatchet. Pieces of torn tissue dangled from the severed edge like grotesque ribbons, and the bone was clearly visible through the mangled flesh. The hand was positioned approximately 8 feet above the ground, spread wide with the palm facing outward, as if waving goodbye, or perhaps reaching for help that would never come. A single railroad spike had been driven through the center of the palm, securing it firmly to the tree's bark. The spike was old and rusted, the kind that might have been salvaged from abandoned railway lines that once crisscrossed this region decades ago. Dark blood had pooled at the base of the tree, soaking into the earth and creating a stain roughly 3 feet in diameter. The blood had coagulated and taken on that dark brown color that indicates it had been there for several days, possibly as long as a week. Flies swarmed around the appendage in a frenzied cloud, their buzzing now the only sound in the otherwise silent clearing. What struck me as particularly disturbing was the deliberate nature of the display. This was not the result of an animal attack or an accidental injury. Someone had intentionally severed this hand, carried it to this remote location, and mounted it on the tree like some macabre trophy or warning sign. The positioning suggested careful planning and a familiarity with the area that implied either extensive knowledge of the park or multiple reconnaissance visits. I forced myself to move closer, fighting against every instinct that screamed at me to flee. My professional training took over, and I began documenting the scene with my camera, taking photographs from multiple angles while being careful not to disturb any potential evidence. The hand appeared to belong to a middle-aged individual, with calloused fingers that suggested manual labor and a plain gold wedding band that had become embedded in the swollen flesh. No other body parts were visible in the immediate area, which raised disturbing questions about the location of the remaining remains. Had the perpetrator disposed of the body elsewhere, or were other sections of the victim scattered throughout different parts of the forest? The thought of stumbling upon additional gruesome discoveries during future patrols sent a chill down my spine. I retreated to a safe distance, and immediately contacted my supervisor using the satellite radio that all rangers carry during solo expeditions. The reception was poor due to the dense tree cover, but I managed to relay the essential details of my discovery. Within 30 minutes, I could hear the distant sound of helicopters approaching, and I used my emergency flare to mark the location for the incoming investigators. The next several hours passed in a blur of activity as crime scene technicians, detectives, and medical examiners descended upon the previously peaceful clearing. They established a perimeter, photographed everything from every conceivable angle, and carefully removed the hand for analysis. Investigators combed through every inch of the surrounding area, searching for additional evidence or clues that might explain how this horror had found its way into our sanctuary. As the sun began to set and the investigative team prepared to leave, I realized that this discovery had fundamentally changed my relationship with these woods. The sense of peace and solitude that I had always found here had been replaced by an underlying current of dread and uncertainty. The days following my discovery blurred together in a seemingly endless series of interviews, reports, and increasingly frustrating dead ends. Detectives from the state police interviewed me repeatedly, going over every detail of that morning with exhausting thoroughness. They wanted to know about my exact route through the forest, the time of each observation I had made, and whether I had noticed anything unusual in the weeks preceding the discovery. I found myself returning to the crime scene multiple times with various investigators, retracing my steps and attempting to remember details that might have seemed insignificant at the time. Had I seen tire tracks on any of the service roads leading into the park? Were there any footprints or disturbed vegetation that might indicate someone had been in the area recently? The questions seemed endless, and my inability to provide useful answers left me feeling increasingly helpless. The forensic analysis of the hand revealed frustratingly little information. The victim was determined to be a Caucasian male, approximately 45 to 55 years old, who had likely performed manual labor based on the callus patterns and scarring on his fingers. The wedding ring provided no leads, as it was a common style available at countless jewelry stores nationwide. Most significantly, the fingerprints and DNA sample yielded no matches in any law enforcement database. Hospital records within a 500-mile radius were searched for anyone who had sought treatment for a severed hand or traumatic amputation during the estimated time frame. Emergency rooms, trauma centers, and even veterinary clinics were contacted, but no one had treated an injury matching this description. This absence of medical records suggested either that the victim had died from blood loss before seeking help, or that someone had prevented him from reaching medical assistance. The railroad spike that had been used to attach the hand to the tree was traced to a lot manufactured in the 1960s, but thousands of these spikes had been distributed to railway companies throughout the region over several decades. Many had been abandoned or sold as scrap metal when sections of track were decommissioned, making it impossible to determine where this particular spike had been acquired. Search teams conducted systematic sweeps of increasingly wider areas around the discovery site, using cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar in an attempt to locate additional remains. They searched abandoned buildings, caves, and every accessible section of the park's backcountry. After 2 weeks of intensive searching, no other body parts were found, and no physical evidence suggested where the rest of the victim might be located. The lack of progress in the investigation began taking a psychological toll on everyone involved. Detectives who had worked hundreds of cases expressed frustration at the complete absence of leads or logical explanations. The deliberate placement of the hand suggested that this was not a random act of violence, but rather a carefully planned message or warning. However, without knowing the victim's identity or the perpetrator's motivation, the meaning behind this gruesome display remained incomprehensible. As weeks turned into months, media attention gradually shifted to other stories, and the investigative team was reduced to a single detective who continued following up on tips and leads that invariably led nowhere. The case file grew thicker with reports of sightings and theories from amateur investigators, but none provided actionable intelligence. Local residents began reporting strange sounds and unexplained phenomena in various parts of the park. Some claimed to have heard screaming in the distance during late-night hours, while others reported seeing unexplained lights moving through the forest. Park management received numerous complaints about the unsettling atmosphere that seemed to have settled over the entire area, and several longtime visitors stopped coming altogether. I found myself becoming increasingly obsessed with the case, spending off-duty hours researching similar crimes and reading everything I could find about ritual violence and symbolic displays of human remains. I contacted retired FBI profilers and attended seminars on criminal psychology, desperate to find some framework that might explain what had happened in our forest. The isolation of the crime scene continued to puzzle investigators. The location was so remote that reaching it required several hours of hiking through difficult terrain. Yet someone had managed to transport not only the severed hand, but also tools necessary to secure it to the tree. This suggested either exceptional physical fitness and wilderness skills, or multiple people working together to accomplish the task. Sleep became elusive as my mind replayed the details of that morning over and over. I found myself questioning whether I had missed something important, some crucial detail that might have provided the breakthrough investigators needed. The image of that pale hand against the dark bark haunted my dreams, and I often woke in the middle of the night with the phantom smell of blood in my nostrils. The psychological impact of the discovery began manifesting in ways I had not anticipated. My routine patrols, once a source of peace and professional satisfaction, became exercises in constant vigilance and barely controlled anxiety. Every unusual sound, every unfamiliar scent, every shadow that seemed out of place triggered an adrenaline response that left me exhausted by the end of each shift. My colleagues began expressing concern about my behavior and mental state. I had become withdrawn and hypervigilant, jumping at unexpected sounds and spending excessive amounts of time documenting even minor irregularities that I encountered during patrols. The freedom and independence that had once made this job so appealing now felt like a burden, as I found myself isolated in vast wilderness areas with nothing but my own increasingly dark thoughts for company. The clearing where I had made the discovery became a focal point of morbid fascination for me. Despite having no official reason to visit the location, I found myself returning there regularly, ostensibly to check for any new evidence or signs of additional disturbance. In reality, I was drawn by a compulsion I could not fully understand or control. Each visit revealed subtle changes that might have been natural environmental processes or could have indicated human interference. Fallen branches appeared in different configurations. Leaves seemed to have been disturbed in patterns that did not match typical wind dispersal, and I occasionally found footprints that could have belonged to investigators, curious hikers, or someone with more sinister intentions. The tree itself bore permanent scars from the railroad spike, and I often found myself staring at the hole in the bark while trying to comprehend the mindset of someone capable of such a calculated act of violence. The surrounding vegetation had begun to grow back around the disturbed earth where the blood had pooled, but the grass in that area remained noticeably different in color and texture. Park management implemented new safety protocols in response to the incident, including mandatory check-ins every 4 hours during solo patrols and restrictions on accessing the most remote areas without backup. These measures provided a certain degree of comfort, but they also served as constant reminders of the violent reality that had invaded our previously safe haven. I began experiencing physical symptoms that my doctor attributed to stress and anxiety. Chronic headaches, difficulty sleeping, and digestive issues became daily challenges that interfered with my ability to perform my duties effectively. Prescription medications provided temporary relief, but the underlying tension and hypervigilance persisted. My personal relationships suffered as I became increasingly preoccupied with the case and less able to engage in normal social interactions. Conversations with family and friends inevitably returned to speculation about the crime, and I found myself analyzing everyone I encountered as a potential suspect or source of information. Trust became a luxury I could no longer afford, and paranoia began coloring my interactions with even longtime colleagues and friends. The seasonal changes that had always provided a sense of natural rhythm and continuity now seemed ominous and threatening. Spring brought concerns about what might emerge from the winter snow. Summer intensified the smell of decomposition from any animal remains I encountered. Autumn's falling leaves could conceal evidence or fresh horrors, and winter's isolation made every sound seem amplified and potentially significant. I started carrying additional equipment during patrols, extra batteries for my radio, a backup GPS unit, more comprehensive first aid supplies, and even a small digital camera specifically for documenting anything that seemed unusual or out of place. My supervisor commented that I had become the most thoroughly prepared ranger in the department, but I knew that no amount of equipment could address the real source of my anxiety. The ongoing presence of law enforcement personnel in the park created an atmosphere of constant investigation that affected both staff and visitors. Everyone felt as though they were under scrutiny, and the natural behaviors of wildlife seemed to change in response to the increased human activity and tension. Even the forest itself felt different, as though the violence that had occurred there had somehow altered its fundamental character. 6 months have passed since that spring morning, when I stumbled upon the severed hand, and the case remains as mysterious as ever. The investigative file has been transferred to the Cold Case Division, where it will likely remain until new evidence emerges, or similar crimes provide additional leads to pursue. The detective assigned to the case still contacts me occasionally to discuss potential new angles or to clarify details from my original statement, but these conversations have become increasingly infrequent and perfunctory. We have established a routine of checking the original crime scene and surrounding areas on a regular basis, maintaining clearer pathways and documenting any changes or anomalies that might indicate renewed activity. This practice serves both an official investigative purpose and provides a sense of control over a situation that has defied all attempts at resolution or understanding. The forest has begun to reclaim the clearing where the hand was discovered, and casual visitors would now find little evidence of the investigation that consumed so many resources and generated so much fear. Nature has a remarkable ability to heal and regenerate, covering scars and absorbing trauma in ways that humans often cannot. The tree continues to grow around the wound left by the railroad spike, and new vegetation has completely obscured the stained earth where blood once pooled. However, those of us who were involved in the discovery and investigation carry permanent reminders of what occurred in that remote section of wilderness. The knowledge that someone was capable of such calculated violence, and that they chose our sanctuary as the location for their disturbing display, has fundamentally altered our relationship with these woods that we are charged with protecting. I have developed new habits and routines that reflect this changed reality. My patrol routes now include regular checks of areas where similar displays might be established, and I maintain detailed logs of any unusual findings or observations. Photography has become an obsession, as I document everything that seems even slightly out of place or different from previous visits. The hand itself has become a symbol of all the unknown dangers that might be lurking in our vast wilderness areas. Park rangers across the country have reached out to share their own experiences with unexplained discoveries and unsolved crimes, and I have learned that such incidents are more common than the general public realizes. Remote locations provide perfect opportunities for those who wish to dispose of evidence or create disturbing displays without risking immediate discovery. Sleep remains elusive, and my dreams are often populated by visions of that pale hand reaching out from the dark bark of the oak tree. Sometimes I dream that I hear the victim calling for help, his voice echoing through the forest but never clear enough for me to determine the direction or distance. These nightmares leave me exhausted and emotionally drained, but they also serve as motivation to continue searching for answers. The wedding ring that was embedded in the swollen flesh continues to haunt my thoughts. Somewhere a spouse may still be wondering what happened to their partner, checking their phone for messages that will never come and holding on to hope that has no foundation in reality. The victim's identity remains unknown, but his humanity is undeniable, and the knowledge that his final moments likely involved unimaginable terror and pain creates a burden of responsibility that I cannot simply abandon. Local folklore has begun incorporating the discovery into stories and legends that are shared around campfires and in community gatherings. The hand in the woods has become a cautionary tale, used to discourage solo hiking and to emphasize the importance of staying on marked trails. While I understand the practical value of such stories in promoting safety awareness, their embellishment and distortion of the facts frustrates my desire for accuracy and resolution. New rangers joining our department receive briefings about the case as part of their orientation and training. They learn about the importance of thorough documentation, proper evidence preservation, and the psychological challenges that can result from exposure to violent crime scenes. These educational efforts help ensure that future discoveries will be handled appropriately, but they also serve as constant reminders of the unresolved mystery that continues to define our professional environment. The investigation may be officially suspended, but my personal commitment to finding answers remains unwavering. I continue reading about similar cases, maintaining correspondence with law enforcement professionals, and exploring new technologies that might provide fresh approaches to analyzing the limited evidence we possess. Someone, somewhere, knows what happened to that man and why his hand ended up nailed to a tree in our forest. The park continues to attract visitors who come seeking peace, adventure, and connection with the natural world. Most remain unaware of the violence that occurred in our most remote section, and I take some comfort in knowing that their experience of this beautiful wilderness is not colored by the knowledge that haunts those of us who work here daily. But I know the truth, and I carry the responsibility of that knowledge with me on every patrol, during every quiet moment when the forest seems to be holding its breath, waiting for the next terrible secret to be revealed. The hand may be gone, but its presence lingers in the shadows between the trees, a reminder that evil can find its way into even the most pristine and protected places. We maintain our vigil, we document our observations, and we hope that someday the mystery will be solved and justice will be served. Until then, we continue our work, forever changed by the knowledge that somewhere in the darkness beyond our sight, there may be someone capable of unimaginable cruelty, and that our peaceful sanctuary once served as the stage for an act of violence that defies explanation or comprehension. The forest keeps its secrets well, but we will never stop listening for the answers that remain hidden in the wind through the trees. Thank God nothing else has happened since, though I fear it may only be a matter of time.